Good morning, everyone. Another day of OCB. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I wanted to start by introducing myself. My name is Heather Benway. I'm a senior research specialist at Woods Hole Oceanographic and the executive officer of the Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry Project Office. I am an oceanographer with interests in carbon and climate science and marine biogeochemistry. For those of you who aren't familiar with OCB, we are a bottom-up program. That means that the leadership and activities of OCB are really shaped by its community through an open process. Our scientific steering committee and its topical subcommittees all include an open community nomination process. So I hope that you're so enthused after attending our workshop that you start attending more activities and get involved. So I just want to start by thanking the millions of people and agencies, and there are so many people to thank when putting something together like this. First and foremost, I would thank our sponsors, both NSF Chemical and Biological Oceanography, as well as the NASA Ocean Biology and Biogeochemistry programs. Our project office is based here at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, so we thank them for taking care of us and hosting us. And when we have our meetings in person, we take over the entire town of Woods Hole. I thank our event hosts, ePoster Boards. Really the biggest shout out to Mike Elliott, who has been guiding us through this platform and developing a really nice interactive space for us since we can't be together in person this year. I want to thank our scientific steering committee and all of the session chairs that contributed to the great sessions we're having this year, as well as our speakers who have been heroic in putting together these pre-recorded talks and adding closed captioning and meeting all of our requests and requirements just to make our meeting as accessible as possible. And I want to thank my co-conspirators in the OCB project office, both May Mahegan, our communications officer, and Mary Mahegan, our administrative officer. And I want to thank you for attending, because that's what really makes our meeting fun, is when people come to it. This workshop was planned while working on the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag Nation, made up of Mashpee, Aquinnah, and Herring Pond tribes. We honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land and the lands of our participants. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and the substantial traditional and local knowledge that Indigenous people hold and sustain. I just want to show this at the beginning. I don't need to read it to you. A lot of it is just common sense and being a good human, but this is really important. And I want to point out that there is an orange code of conduct button that you can see here in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. You will also see that in the ePoster Boards platform on the right side. I think it's on the right side. Bright orange button. If you find behavior that's disturbing, whether it is towards you or towards you witness it towards anybody else, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We have an incident reporting incident reporting form, or you can reach out to us by email. We take this very seriously. Harassment, bullying, any of this is just ruins a meeting experience, and often, in many cases, a scientific career for people. So please take this seriously. Click on the orange button if something is disturbing to you. It's right there. It's out in the open.
Hey, Heather, sorry to break in on you real quick. I just wanted to let you know we're not seeing your slides. Do you mind just resharing them real quick?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, you haven't missed too much anyway.
There we go. Perfect. We see it now.
Just me talking. Everybody can see okay? So ePoster Boards has customized this meeting space to really help meet the needs of our workshop and foster as many high quality interactions as we can. And obviously we can't perfectly replicate an in-person meeting, but we can do a lot with this platform. So please be patient. Please play with it. There are technical problems will happen. Please be patient with that. Often a refresh of your browser will fix it if you have an issue. There are ePoster Board staff at help desks all throughout the platform, so look for those. And there's also an OCB help desk in most of the spaces. I wanted to point out that in the lobby on the bottom center, there's an idle parking area table in the bottom. If you want to kind of check out and turn off your camera and microphone for a bit, you don't want to disconnect from the meeting, but you need to check your email. That's a great place to do that, or you can use empty tables in the networking area. Please take a couple of minutes. It really doesn't take long to watch the intro OCB video. You'll see this in the upper left corner of pretty much all the meeting spaces. You click on that video, it will help orient you to the platform and some of the specific activities and functions of our workshop. You can use the elevator to go up and down. There are 8 floors to this space, so please take note of that because that's in pretty much every space that you're in. I think in the poster area, we'll only be using the first 2 floors, but in the networking space, for example, we are using all 8 floors, and we're pretty much going to be in all of these spaces today. So the lobby is where you came in. That's where we have informal interaction and happy hours, and that's also the entry point to the system. The breakout rooms is where we're having our plenary sessions as well as other small group discussions. We'll be using the lecture hall today for agency reports, and we'll have several OCB activity report outs there as well. The poster hall, pretty self-explanatory. You just navigate to the green button and you'll be in an interactive poster hall. We are having poster presentations on these days, June 11th, 15th, 18th, and 22nd. You'll also note that there's a poster directory to tell you who's presenting on what day and where. And there's also a poster gallery site. That is a virtual poster gallery that will be open through August. So you can go and browse the posters on your own time as well, in addition to having this interactive time with a presenter. And finally, we'll be having a networking session. This is a great opportunity to connect, talk with colleagues about science, life stuff, diversity issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So please take time to explore this space fully. So today we're starting with our plenary session, Ocean-based negative emissions technologies, here in the breakout room. At the conclusion of this, I actually wanted to point out that this is kind of the beginning of discussions to seed a potential new OCB research area, trying to engage the scientific community in discussions about carbon dioxide removal and the science, the research that's needed in order to vet these potential technologies. And so we as a scientific community really need to engage. If things go forward without that engagement, that's often when mistakes and consequences, undesired consequences happen. So it's really critical that we as a community engage. And so that's one of the reasons for this. There's a lot going on the national and international front in CDR right now. So I wanted to point out that the discussions you have today could very well start new collaborations and form the basis for a new OCB research area. I also want to point out that there are networking tables in the networking space that are focused on this topic so that you can go in and continue your discussions from today during the networking session. We're going to have a quick break. Then we're going to go into poster presentations. The poster hall will be open a few minutes early for poster presenters. So I recommend you presenters get in there a little early just to get set up and familiarized with the platform, especially if you didn't get into a training session. After the posters, we are going back to the lecture hall for agency updates. These are some of the most highly anticipated events during OCB, so I recommend you stick around. We'll hear today from NSF, NASA, and NOAA. We'll start with brief report outs on behalf of each agency, and then we'll have an open Q&A session. And at the end, we will have time at the end for networking. So we'll go to the networking space, and you will explore all 8 floors. There is the first floor, which will be focused on JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm hoping we can continue the momentum from Friday's conversations. We started a Jam board, which you'll be able to, this is basically a Google Doodle board to share ideas and sticky notes. So there'll be a link to that in the JEDI spaces. So you can go in there and take notes and give us advice. So use that as a tool, as a community tool. Floors 2 through 4 are focused on research and ocean observing topics. Floor 5 is an open floor. You can grab an empty table just to chill or gather with a group to discuss whatever you want. If you want topics added to a table, if you want to label a table with a certain topic to attract people, just reach out to me or one of the ePoster Boards technicians to do so. Floor 6 will have agencies, OCB table, and partner program tables. Floor 7 is life topics, and floor 8 is early career. And they also have their own Jamboard. So that you can link to it right from the table whiteboards. So I highly recommend getting involved in that too. All in all, please enjoy the platform and really use it for what it's meant to be, for interaction, for meaningful interaction with your colleagues. At this point, I'd like to pass it off to Mike Elliott to give a few brief remarks about the platform, and then we'll get started.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to be your hosts in this virtual conference software. There's a little bit of a learning curve, as Heather mentioned, with the software compared to a typical Zoom or Teams meeting. So we want you to know how you can find us for tech help, and we like to ask for patience and grace as everyone learns how to navigate this software, since many of you are first-time guests and presenters. So sorry to those of you who are hearing some of this content again from attending a prior session, but some of it is going to be new today. Right now, we're in what we call stage presentation mode, and we're in the breakout room event space. The stage presentation takes over everyone's screen, so we all see what's on stage regardless of what table we're at in the room. If you're not a speaker, you can interact via the chat or the Q&A panel at the right side of your screen. You can enter things in the Q&A anonymously, and you can click items in the Q&A to upvote questions or comments that you'd like to see featured or addressed by the speakers. So today, as Heather mentioned, the program is split between multiple event spaces. Each space has its own function, and keep your eyes peeled for announcements that are directing you to the event spaces where activities will be taking place. For the upcoming session, we're going to stay right here in stage mode and bring a group of panelists on stage. They're going to go through a presentation, issue a charge to breakout sessions. We'll do a Q&A as well. And at that point, we're going to return you to map mode. So when we return you to map mode, you're going to find yourself at a table with others. You'll see icons filling seats on the map, and each icon represents a person. Each table is intentionally limited to the number of visible seats, and you can move to a new table by double-clicking anywhere that has an open seat. So during the sessions today, except for when we're on stage as we are now, you can control your camera and microphone via a control panel at the bottom of the screen. We certainly encourage everyone to be an active participant and have their cameras and microphones on. Consider muting your microphone temporarily if you hear any audio feedback when others are speaking, and headphones are definitely your friend when it comes to preventing audio feedback. So know that you're never stuck where you are in the software unless we're in stage presentation mode like we are now. We've put a link at the top of the general chat in this space and in the lecture hall in case you need to leave either space during the presentations. You can always return to the lobby where everything else is accessible. We encourage you to move around and meet as many people as possible and have great conversations. And then after the plenary and breakouts, we'll be moving to the posters. Around 20 poster presenters will be available today, spread across 2 floors in the poster hall. Each presenter will be set up at a particular station. You'll see the presenter's name at the bottom. We have a button available also, as Heather mentioned, where you can see the poster directory. That will show you which presenters are available on which dates, and then where they'll be in the virtual poster hall. So we only have about 45 minutes in that space today, and please be sure you visit as many poster stations as you can. Ask lots of questions, definitely be an active participant. Again, you want to turn your video and microphone on while you're viewing posters to have good interaction. And so poster presenters may be screen sharing their poster live, in which case you can click on it to get a better view. They may also be sharing their poster in the whiteboard at their station. So be sure to look at the map to see whether or not a poster presenter is in the room. And then if you see their icon, they should be there to chat with you. If you don't see their icon in their room, maybe visit another station, plan to come back after a few minutes. You can find all of the posters in the gallery, which again is a button on the side. And you can also, again, find them at the whiteboard at the assigned stations. So we wanted to quickly point out a new whiteboard feature that helps with poster viewing, and it can be used for the breakouts as well. When you and others have the whiteboard open at your station, you'll see colored circles in the upper right corner of the window for each person who's viewing the whiteboard. If you click on a person's icon in that upper right corner, you can then click on an option to follow them, which allows you to copy their view exactly as they move through the whiteboard. So this is a great way to view the posters. It's also helpful for the breakout sessions. If you're viewing a poster in the whiteboard, just consider clicking on the poster presenter's icon and then following them, and that way you can see exactly as they present. So you can also click on any person's icon in the whiteboard and click Bring to Me, and that brings their view to exactly what yours is, and that way you can kind of collaborate on activities in the whiteboard. So again, feel free to use both of those new features anytime you're in the whiteboard today, whether that's in the breakouts or in the posters. I also wanted to just quickly talk about the chat feature. The general chat addresses everyone in the room. The table chat addresses everyone currently at the table with you. And then you can also use the chat to search for individuals and send private messages. Just please note that although the private chat messages can go across floors and tables, they cannot go across rooms. So if you're in the lobby and you send a message to someone who's in the breakout room, that recipient, the person who's in the other room, will not see that message until they return to the room that you sent the chat message in. Hopefully that makes sense. So throughout the event, in all active event spaces, you'll be able to find ePoster board staff if you need any help. If you connect to any of the spaces labeled Help Desk, we should be there to help you. If you're having trouble finding us on the upper floors, come down to floor 1 and check that Help Desk. You can also double click and join us wherever we are. If you see a little yellow star on our icons on the map view, you can also message us via the participants list or the chat. So one last comment, which is very important: refreshing your browser window will kick you out temporarily and bring you back in automatically. You don't have to log in again. Refreshing the page will resolve the vast majority of technical hiccups with the software. So for example, if your camera and mic won't activate, if you suddenly can't hear or see the stage presentation, if the software won't allow you to move, just try a quick browser refresh, and that you'll find likely resolves the issue that you're having. So I've covered a lot of information here, and in case you didn't catch all of that, I want to remind you that there's a software tutorial video near the top left of each map that can help you get started. You can play that at any time and return to it whenever it's convenient for you. So have fun, and please don't hesitate to find us if you have any tech support needs. And with that, we're going to bring up Leonard and Heather, I believe, as the speakers for our next session. So thanks for your attention. And Leonard, go ahead and you can activate your camera and microphone, and we'll see you in just a moment.
Yes. Hello. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, so I hope. Yeah, okay.
Perfect, we'll see it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Yes, so welcome also from my side. My name is Leonard Bach. I'm from the University of Tasmania. And I first of all also want to thank Jamie, Claire, Patrick, May, and Heather for organizing this session. We together organized this, and it was great fun. Yeah, my OCB experience continues to be great. So thank you very much to you, and also thanks to the speakers who I will introduce or show summary slide of in this presentation. Alrighty, let's get started. Just to bring everyone on the same page, I just want to organize negative emission technologies, abbreviated ONADs, in the tree of geoengineering. Well, geoengineering is not such a en vogue term anymore, but I'd say it's still the umbrella term for all this. And we can basically go down the taxonomy and subdivide it into climate engineering and maybe hydroengineering. Hydroengineering being not directly climate relevant, but you know what the Russians tried to do in the 50s, 60s to divert rivers in Russia from towards the Arctic towards the south to irrigate fields. But we're obviously looking in the wider context of climate engineering. There's two subcategories, mainly CO2 removal and solar radiation management. We'll be looking at CO2 removal. And then there's land-based methods and ocean-based methods. We are looking at ocean-based methods. And then we go more into the detail and actually look at the specific tools we have at hand. And I would say there's currently 5 bigger ones. Of course, there's hybrid approaches and smaller subcategories for each one of them again. But we are mainly looking today from this altitude onto the issue. Right, and to start, to bring everyone, kind of get everyone into the grind, I just want to re-emphasize how hard it really is to sequester CO2, or what kind of things have to be met in order to achieve successful atmospheric CO2 sequestration. First of all, we obviously need to have some method to fix CO2 in seawater. And then the next step would be, we obviously need to permanently store the CO2 somewhere in the ocean, be it in the deep ocean or elsewhere. And by permanent, this is a poorly defined term, but probably something more than 100 years. Then the next step is, we not only have to fix seawater CO2, we afterwards have to equilibrate the seawater CO2 deficit with atmospheric CO2. So this is the actual thing we want, right? We want atmospheric CO2 removal, so we need to account for air-sea gas exchange, which is not a small problem. And at that point, we also need to account how much CO2 is actually going into the ocean, and we need to develop independent tools or independent methods to verify how much it actually is, because ultimately all this is going to be very expensive. We need to finance it, and in order to finance it, we need to account it very precisely and accurately. Then we have potential for lots of side effects along the way. Obviously, we want to know, do these affect the environment? Could be in a bad way, could be in a good way also. That's something we need to understand, and mostly haven't. Then these side effects, they can reduce the CO2 fixation through indirect, or direct feedbacks within the system. That is something we need to account for, or we need to reveal. But also we have to open our eyes outside the carbon world. So we have not only have to look at the carbon cycle, but we have to look further and look at radiative feedback mechanisms that could occur that are not directly linked to the carbon cycle, such as cloud feedbacks that could be induced, or other things that affect radiative forcing. Because radiative forcing is ultimately the thing we're interested in. We're not primarily interested. Well, we often look at the thing from a carbon cycle perspective, but we're actually interested in radiative forcing, which can be changed in other ways as well. And then, of course, we have a whole lot of outside our comfort zone problems, such as we have to deal with social acceptability of the approach. And of course, we have to make sure all of this is legal. And what I personally hope for OCB, or for this workshop, is first of all, that we embrace that there's more than just the simple CO2 fixation to start off with. So all these problems are potential knockout criteria, and that we kind of develop a pathway towards establishing these knockout criteria, and then we also kind of find a way to include them in the process and say, okay, if one of these knockout criteria is not met, then we do not really have to look further and kind of can discard the approach we're looking at. Righty. Okay, so a bit of an overview what we have heard already from our talks, from our speakers, and start with David's talk. David gave an overview presentation about ocean-based negative emission technologies, about why we need it, and a bit of a summary as well. And so it's a bit subjective. I picked out a couple of slides which I thought were really, really important to reiterate here again. So this is the first one. This basically shows the trajectory we have to follow if we want to meet 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius or below 1.5, well, between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming targets with minimal negative emission technologies. And you see that the downward trajectories of emissions is absolutely unrealistic for the vast majority of people believe that this is unrealistic. So personally, I think this is really important to emphasize, because what I hope we don't have to do again here is to discuss whether or not CO2 removal is actually needed, because I think probably my parents could have had this discussion, but I think we are now past that point and probably don't have to discuss this again. And that's why I think this plot from David's talk is very important. The second one that I found particularly important is this one. And just look at the amount of redness in, well, in all these. Basically, he also has a table of knockout criteria. And what this table basically shows is that our research is just at the start. So we have actually very little knowledge or huge knowledge gaps and cannot fully assess our negative emission technologies or CO2 removal methods we have at hand at the moment. Then there was a talk by Ross Rickaby, and Ross talked about ocean alkalinity enhancement. And Ross pointed out a really important feedback mechanism that is often neglected. So ocean alkalinity enhancement obviously aims to increase ocean alkalinity, thereby storing CO2 dissolved in seawater. But what could happen is that because we have more alkalinity, there's also potential for more calcification to occur. And obviously when we calcify, we reduce alkalinity again, and therefore we counteract our desired CO2 removal indirectly. And this could also be driven by ocean biology. And Ross provided some really neat examples from the paleo record and also from culture experiments that this is, well, a realistic threat that this may happen, so that we just fertilize calcifiers by adding alkalinity, thereby counteracting the desired effect. Something to investigate further for sure. And Ross is really doing great stuff there. And then we had a talk by Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers about blue carbon. And the one slide that really got stuck in my head afterwards was this one, and which showed that even if we generate substantial amounts of CO2 removal on a per square meter basis per year with blue carbon, there's potential for these kind of feedbacks, because at the same time, probably because there's anoxia in the water there, there's a lot of methane production coming alongside the CO2 removal, and this kind of outweighs the positive effect of radiative forcing through CO2 removal by the counteracting effect of releasing methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas. So that is something to keep in mind, that CO2 removal is not everything. Then we had Nicole Price's talk about ocean afforestation. And Nicole identified key knowledge gaps we have to solve along the way. And one which stuck out to me, because I think the OCB community is very qualified to address this, is asking, can we accurately predict and verify where the detritus goes and how long the carbon stays buried? So by buried, most likely buried in marine sediments below seaweed farms that exist due to remove CO2 from seawater. Then we have Yoon's talk about ocean iron fertilization. Yoon wrote a really nice paper published in 2018 in Biogeosciences about ocean synthesis, the latest synthesis about ocean iron fertilization. And Yoon also explains in her talk what needs to happen or how the settings should be for successful CO2 removal with ocean iron fertilization. So where would it be? Where would it have to happen in order to be most successful? When? So which season? And how long would experiments or observations have to be in order to truly assess what's actually happening with the carbon after the ocean iron fertilization has happened, which is one of these major uncertainties in this research space. Then we have David Corwick's talk about artificial upwelling. And David points out that there's been quite some modeling studies on artificial upwelling and some earlier smaller scale experiments. But there's a huge disconnect between the model studies and the and the field trials. Obviously, models can models just can go much larger scale without a problem. Because the CDR efficiency and the potential scales with the scale of application, this gap between the models and the applications needs to be filled to some extent in the next year and the next years. Then there was a talk by Veronica Tampus and Julius Buseke who presented together. And you may have noticed that this is kind of an outlier because it's not addressing a specific ocean-based negative emission technology, but instead it addresses a problem, because we felt like this problem is so central to all of the methods that we thought, okay, this topic deserves an extra talk. And we have also very limited data on this. So the problem, when we talk about permanence, we mean how long is CO2 actually stored somewhere in the mainly in the deep ocean after sequestration there. And what Veronica pointed out that this timescales are highly model dependent, and they are shorter with increasing model resolution. So when you have a higher resolution model, you tend to have much shorter permanence. And then Julius pointed out, and that was really a wake-up call for me. So hello from CMIP 6, sorry. So there's when you compare models for age traces at 200-meter depth, for example, you have a 1,500 years difference between the models. So just throwing our models at this problem to get some numbers is probably not enough. We actually need to do a little bit more here in order to truly understand how long carbon is sequestered in the ocean. Then there was a talk by Candice Callison about community engagement ethics. So a non-biogeochemical talk. And I felt like Candice really got me with her question, which she asked in her summary in the end, asking, okay, who are we actually serving with this research or with these endeavors? And we should ask ourselves these things more frequently. And I totally agree, because when I ask myself the question, I sometimes think, oh, perhaps I just do it to do exciting science. And I'm often, well, I should be thinking more about the problem for which these, about the people for which I'm supposed, or we are supposed to solve these problems. So I found this really, or at least for me, it was really eye-opening, her talk. Last, just the anticipated ONAD learning curve. I have so this is really subjective. Obviously, you can disagree with me very much. I hope you do. So this is perhaps our confidence level. I saw this kind of plot before. I think it's from Sarah Cooley originally, and I've seen it in a paper from Katrina Hurd. And so the confidence level, it usually starts that we have very limited understanding, are very optimistic about an approach. Then it turns into frustration because we figure out it's not that easy. It's way harder, and there's seemingly huge hurdles in the way. And then at some point the real science starts, and we're getting into it. And I think for most of the methods we're currently looking at, we're still in this, perhaps a bit overly optimistic phase that we haven't really gotten to the point where the frustration starts, except for iron fertilization, where there's been quite a bit of disappointment, I think. But that is actually very important to have that method included further and also being studied further, because I talked recently to Phil Boyd about this, and he coined the term a vanguard method, which I think is totally true. So we need to well, keep looking at iron fertilization, because perhaps, or maybe likely, all the other methods follow its trajectory. Yeah, and with that, I just want to stop, and I hope I haven't been too long. And I look forward to the discussion now. So thank you. Perhaps everyone, all the speakers, come to the stage now, and start put on their mics and their camera. And yeah, perhaps Candice, can I ask you? Heather said you're pretty, you're in a rush and don't have too much time. Is that correct?
I thought that I was only on till 6, but I can stay a little bit longer.
Okay. So.
Oh, sorry, 6 my time. Yeah.
Okay, perhaps we start with everyone like saying hello and giving like a very brief summary where you're from. Perhaps we start with you, Candice. What your involvement in ONADs is, perhaps, and
well, I have no involvement in ONAD. I got an email out of the blue from Jamie Poulter, I think her last name is, who asked me if I would be willing to talk with you about my research, but also about the kinds of ethical questions that you're facing, you're thinking about, and to put some more on the table for you. So that's really where I'm coming from. I am a member of a First Nation here in BC, the Tahltan Nation, and I'm talking to you from Musqueam land. So I'm very much aware of the challenges around colonialism in certainly North America, but aware of it throughout the world. And that's really where I'm coming from on a scholarly level. I'm a Indigenous scholar, but I work in media and on environmental issues, and I've written about climate change sort of quite a bit over the last decade or so.
Yeah, and perhaps because you're leaving soon, I'll ask you a question that was really on my heart, and apologize German directness. So if that question is totally inappropriate, just tell me.
Okay.
No problem with that. But so I was wondering. So obviously you noticed the issue with the Haida people during the ocean iron fertilization. Well, there was this rogue experiment in 2012 that took place, right? And I was wondering, because it was planned together with the Haida people at the beginning, as far as I understood it, right? So they kind of, the goal was to bring the salmon back. But did they feel betrayed at the end because they realized that there was a big media backfire? Or like, what's their point of view on this now?
So I'm not Haida. I can't speak for Haida in any way, but my understanding from watching it unfold is that there was one village that was very supportive and involved in it from the beginning. Kate Gagne's article on this, I think, is really comprehensive in terms of explaining the history. But if you understand the situation here in BC, there are no treaties with Indigenous, like 2/3 of Indigenous nations in BC. And what the Supreme Court case law will tell you is that the nation has to provide consent for these issues. And that's become even more important with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but particularly in Haida Gwaii, Haida Nation, has a title claim that covers not only the land, but also the seabed around it. And so really that's where consent needed to be sought. And my understanding that is that it wasn't. And that the Haida Nation leaders went on record as saying this was too great of a risk for the environment. So I think it's very complicated. I think there, in Kate's piece, she describes families and the communities as being divided. But again, this is partly why I ask these complicated questions at the end of my presentation about the histories and contexts and relations that exist. And I think that those sorts of things, you really have to understand the complicated details and the history of colonialism in whatever area you're going into, for sure in Canada and the United States, but I would argue elsewhere as well.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Didn't know that there was like, even within the Haida group, that there was different opinions on this. That's interesting. Okay, so everyone else, can we quickly go through the speakers and everyone introduces themselves, perhaps?
Leonard, can we have a question here in the chat from Claire that is relevant to what we were just speaking about. It says, I appreciated Candice's remarks about being concerned about proposals for quick fixes versus real changes in human uses of the earth. Any further comments on this view?
Yeah, I mean, do you really want my real opinion? Okay, so I mean, I think the reason why I, have begun writing specifically about fire as it relates to climate change more recently is because of the rise in attention towards Indigenous burning practices. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but certainly in BC, but also in California and especially in Australia, you've seen much more attention paid to the way that Indigenous people have been paying attention to, managing their forests since time immemorial, which, really refers to 10,000 years or more, right? So I think that really has made me think a lot more closely about how it is that climate change, any sort of address of climate change doesn't also include an address of the sort of capitalist systems that we have in place, the way that many of the developments that we put in place on lands, and this would be included in coastal development as well, aren't also addressed as part of climate change. Instead, we're looking to make, fixes as opposed to fixing the root of the problem. And so, to me, I think Indigenous people often have very diverse ways of living with their environment, and there's a lot of instruction there, burning practices being one example of it. But I think that there's, got to be some attention paid to the roots of, much of climate change being in the sort of industrialization and capitalism and colonialism as it's caught up in that. It's a very general answer, but.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps one more question from my side, because this topic's really interesting. Do you think that Indigenous people would in general be very negative about this whole topic about geoengineering, or in a more specified way, CO2 removal?
My experience in talking with people once the ocean fertilization experiment was made public is most people were shocked and reluctant and sort of like, does it work? Would it bring the salmon back? Most nations here on the Northwest Coast are salmon people. Like, salmon are central to our culture and our values and our way of life. So there's that, but there is a real reluctance to tinker, tamper, change any aspect of our relations without being very clear, that we have permission from lands, waters, non-humans. So much of our culture is built on our relations. I often give the example of when we're fishing for salmon. We fish, and then when we bring them up on the land, we hang them to drip dry for a while. And you have to hang them facing a particular direction so that the salmon in the river know which way to keep going, right? So we're very aware of the sort of broad kind of spiritual, physical interactions in our stories, in our practices. And so, the kinds of things that are being proposed impact those relations between non-humans, between humans and non-humans, between what we would call more than humans, lands, waters, and so those sorts of questions, like the questions kind of proliferate from understanding the density with which Indigenous people understand their relations. And I don't know if you've read Julie Cruikshank's work, but she has a great book called Do Glaciers Listen? She's not Indigenous, but she's worked for a long time with Champagne-Ajac elders in the Yukon. And glaciers are so responsive in that culture. It's phenomenal, right? And often scientists don't know that. They come into a glacier, they might show a sign of disrespect, and the glacier responds, right? And there's records of that over time, right, since contact. So I think like the responsiveness of the environment in broad terms is really built into a lot of our cultural frameworks, and there's a reluctance, right, to mess with that in any way, whether or not there's positive benefits.
Right, thank you. It seems close to impossible to interfere with the needs of Indigenous people when you enter this space, right?
Yeah, I mean, so much of our ways of thinking about ourselves are absolutely connected to land, even our languages. I heard an amazing scholar, Lorna Williams, she's now emeritus from University of Victoria, talk about how language really is our way of expressing our relations, right, with land, and that it's a way of the land speaking with us. And so, so much is built around that. And so much of our language reflects that. My grandmother is named for the sparkles on the water in a particular place where the Tahltan and the Stikine River come together. So like those are things that our ancestors have noticed, named, treasured over long periods of time.
Yep. Yeah.
Candice, how do we, I mean, when it is this colonialism, and I mean, we've created this problem and now we're looking to solve it. And, it's really critical that we engage with Indigenous communities, because there's so much knowledge there that we, how do we build that rapport? Do you have, it's so important to engage those knowledge in those communities, because they're being affected by whatever choices or scientific research we pursue. Are there mechanisms to develop those relationships? And, there's clearly some acknowledgement and humility and recognition of who created the problem, and I can understand the reluctance to engage. And I just wonder if you have advice, because it's so critical to engage, how to overcome that barrier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really about dealing with, the specificity and diversity of Indigenous people and building relationships. I mean, those are very complex tasks. I've done a lot of research across the Arctic and talked to Arctic scientists who, have both successfully and unsuccessfully worked with Indigenous people and diverse Indigenous people. And I think, what I always hear from the scientist side is they're shocked that Indigenous people want to, you know, learn about their science and learn about their research. And it's like, of course they do. This is like, you know, a way of adding to their knowledge and perspective. And they recognize that scientific research brings often a global perspective, often a larger regional perspective. So I think that's, you know, one aspect of it. But the other is to recognize Indigenous knowledge as its own field of expertise, and not sort of a supplement to what it is that you're doing, and not looking for consent right off the bat, but perhaps looking for a conversation, looking to recognize that you're talking to people who are experts on their own lands and waters and histories, and who are often contending with multiple and long-term challenges. So to me, there's like there's, you know, a challenge in both understanding, you know, what kind of context you're walking into, legal and otherwise, but also recognizing the ways in which science has often dismissed, you know, very generally speaking, dismissed, ignored, you know, put it off to the side in terms of what Indigenous people know, what they bring to the table. So I think like those conversations are like vital. Both, I think it makes scientific research better. There's, you know, tons of studies that will tell you that, but it also means that you have people who are, you know, engaged in what it is that you're doing, and it also might help you to figure out whether or not the problems have been defined correctly, whether or not this is what communities see as crisis. And again, like back to this question that Leonard raised at the beginning, like who are you serving with these projects?
Okay, are there other questions to Candice about this topic? Good stage.
In the chat from Jamie, and I see a question from Matthias.
I think Matthias has a comment on.
Oh, it's a comment. Okay, there's a YouTube.
Yeah, he's right. Andrea Reed is a great resource. She's got a new lab at UBC and is a Nisga'a scientist. So Nisga'a are a nation right next to mine on the Northwest Coast.
Yeah, and Julia says this is like you're making a really important point here with like well, not utilizing but implementing the Indigenous knowledge into this research field from early on. This could also kind of, well, it sounds a bit bad, but you know, save a lot of trouble later on if you just engage too late. I just heard this. Well, I read the media news about the field trials about solar radiation management, which they tried to do in the Arctic and in Europe. Was it in Sweden or in Finland? And then they ran into real problems with the Indigenous people were against it, and then they couldn't do it. So you must engage. Okay. So Jamie asks or says, there might be an interesting connection between Candice's remarks and Nicole's talk. Nicole's work on seaweed cultivation could have nutritional benefits while also leading to carbon sequestration in the sediment. I wonder how the community sees that work. I guess the Indigenous community, Jamie, right? So basically, how do Indigenous people, would they be positive about, let's ask perhaps a bit more broadly about this nature-based solution space that, you know, when people say that seaweed farming would be natural, which it may or may not be, but I don't know. Are they more affine to these nature-based solutions?
Leonard, are you asking me or Candice?
I guess, Jamie, you can probably say if I interpreted your questions incorrectly, or perhaps you better to ask it yourself.
I think Jamie's asking more generally how the community in general, not just Indigenous communities, view seaweed cultivation.
I
can speak a little bit about what the Working Waterfront thinks about it in Maine. So just to introduce myself to everyone out there, my name's Nicole Price. I'm a senior research scientist at the Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences, and I'm also the director of our Center for Seafood Solutions. And I have to say the questions about seaweed farming did not come from scientists directly in the lab. They came from our partnerships through the center with industry members, environmental groups, and policymakers curious about what all seaweed farming has in terms of positive and negative potential environmental impacts to the local marine environment. And, you know, at least for some of the Working Waterfront folks, they see seaweed farming as a diversification strategy away from wild capture fisheries and into a market that might be more sustainable moving into the future. It brings revenue in a time of year when wild capture fisheries, especially lobstering, is ceased because it's a winter crop. And seaweed farming has been happening for centuries. It's only 10 years old in the US, but centuries elsewhere. So it's been a part of the Indigenous culture in Maine for quite some time also, just a harvesting of beach wrack. But farming has been part of shoreline communities' processes for gaining nutritional products out of the sea for quite some time. I think we're only just beginning to understand what farming could or could not do for the environment.
Yes, I think time-wise we need to start with the breakout group discussions now. Heather, is that right? Yeah, okay. So what we'll do next is we'll go into our individual breakout groups, which are sorted, organized with like as a topic or as a negative emission technology, right? So there's a couple of tables, and you'll join one, and then it's really important that within each of these tables that you assign a reporter, so someone who makes marks, so that when we come back together in the end, that we have a discussion on what you discussed there, what the key knowledge gaps are, and what the way forward is, and also how OCB can help to facilitate this process, as this is a new research topic, yeah, so that we can develop something here.
Yes, I want to follow up just to remind you that there are 8 floors. So if a topic table that you really want to sit at gets full, please go ahead up to the 2nd floor and start a new table. And I would ask that our amazing panelists please spread your expertise across the tables, and so that you're all interacting with participants. And I just really want to thank all of our speakers, because you all covered a really vast ground, and I really appreciate all of the different contributions that you made to knit this session together. So a big virtual applause to our speakers for this session. And I'm looking forward to our breakout groups. Again, remember, if you're the reporter, put your name and your topic table in the chat so we can call on you later when we report back at 10 o'clock.